Just like my country, I'm young, scrappy, and hungry, and I'm not throwing away my shot. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Folks, we need to be hungry for God's kingdom on earth, and if we can't feel it, we need to follow those who can. Those who feel the urgency of the moment, those who feel the potent strain between the world as it is and the world as it should be. Those who do not just sit and wait for the moment to come to them, but chase down those pivotal points that call for courage and conviction and sacrifice. This is our moment, our time, and our chance. And we can't throw it away. Lin-Manuel Miranda apparently picked up a biography of Alexander Hamilton while on vacation. And he was a few pages in when he said, "I know this story." Alexander Hamilton was orphaned, self-taught, and in the wake of tragedy, he was able to write so powerfully that it inspired his community to send him to school in the mainland colonies. Once there, Alexander Hamilton used his writing as a force to move towards revolution, to become Washington's aide-de-camp, a soldier, a war hero, author of the Federalist Papers, first Secretary of the Treasury, pickers of more battles than one, before going to the presses himself to reveal a scandalous affair, and later dueling Aaron Burr, only to be killed in the process. So what did Mr. Miranda see in this story? He saw an immigrant story of someone who was given an opportunity and grabbed it for a new life. What did he see in this story? He saw a hip-hop story of someone who was able to write their way out of their circumstances and into a new one. And today we hold this beside a faith story, and one that is almost infamous. As David talks his way onto a battlefield to face Goliath. David wasn't supposed to be there in the first place. David was supposed to be the errand boy, the youngest son, bringing supplies from home to his 3 older brothers who were actually in Saul's army. Instead, David had a bit of a mouth on him. All the Israelites are huddling around from a man who was 6 cubits high and a span, who wore a helmet of bronze and a coat of mail, and a javelin of bronze on his shoulder, and a spear like a weaver's beam. He stood there challenging the people for a champion to settle their war. And a sane person would stay quiet and still, and perhaps move in the opposite direction. And instead, Pipsqueak David comes up with some bravado and bluster, gets himself called before the king, where he manages to talk his way into the role of champion, relying on his previous experiences with lions and bears, declaring that if God saved him from that, then God will save him now. David casts aside the armor that didn't fit him to begin with and heads down with a staff and a sling and 5 smooth stones. He doesn't have a gun to brandish, and yet he walks onto the battlefield. This kind of hunger without resources, trust in something bigger because you don't have the strength on its own. This has deep roots in our faith tradition. God has a habit of seeing the worth in the younger children who weren't supposed to be there. God has a tendency to choose the smallest tribes for outsized roles. God has a tradition of bringing those who've been enslaved and paving the road to freedom. God has a practice of calling the forgotten, the lost, the losers, the loners, those who have fatal flaws and unlikely gifts. For what was the early church but a ragtag crew of fools, screw-ups, sinners, and overly independent ladies? who somehow went from huddling in an upper room to creating a movement that would circle the globe. And yet, I know if someone was to describe the church today, they might not use the words young, scrappy, and hungry. We at times can be a better fit for a lumbering entity with lots of armor. For we as the church have power. I think of the government task force established this week that appears to be laboring under the assumption that the Christian church is being persecuted in the United States. Which I can say as a religious leader that freedom of worship is not being impinged by requiring human decency in the public square. Not being able to use your power to deny services to others is not actually oppression. For there is a danger in taking on the mantle of the underdog without actually taking your armor off. Even David did not stay the underdog for long, as our story last week showed that once in power, David also had the power to abuse it. Even as Hamilton's story would reveal, you cannot always write your way out of really questionable decisions. So what are we, as the not quite powerless, not really underdog, predominantly white middle-class church, have to learn from someone who's young, scrappy, and hungry? We can learn an urgency. Folks in these stories feel the burden of reality as they know it, and how different it is from a world of righteousness and truth. And they feel between that gap the willingness to throw their very bodies in between, to see if they can be the bridge between one world and the next. These are very high stakes that matters, and folks with gumption, conviction, and just enough foolishness not to know the impossibility of the task they have taken on. For what are we talking about with David and with Hamilton? But fools who try to topple empires, construct new nations, throw untried skills into a task where experts have shied away. This is the kind of tasks that are left only to the foolish and the faithful. And I'm not under any illusion at this moment that our stakes are low in this world, at this moment or any. For we are now determining what course we will go and how. We are each living our one life, and determining by where we place our hours, our energy, and our pocketbook what our legacy will be. There are times when I fear whether our world will move towards its better angels or its fouler ones. There are times when I feel ill-equipped to respond, where I would like to hide or run away or duck, or take just a little responsibility and no chances. But these stories remind us that God does not call the equipped, but equips those who God calls. You follow God first, and then God provides what we need. We need these stories to remind us of what that foolish brand of holy courage looks like. Part of what the great joy of the musical Hamilton is that the right story found the right people. For me, as a white citizen of this country, there has never been a question that the story of the Revolutionary War was mine. Recent genealogy efforts have said I could claim my status as daughter of the American Revolution. I have always known that the history of the revolution by white colonists against the oppressions of taxation and of foreign power, that was taught my elementary school classes on belonged to me. Part of what made this musical powerful has to see this heritage claimed, owned, and belonging to people of color. The revolutionaries and founding fathers cast as people of color and so claimed the founding of our nation as a story of Black and brown people. To say that those are immigrant stories, justice stories, underdog stories, and it makes me, in a way, proud to see what I hope for. And for us, are we learning to cast our faith stories in the same way, to stand beside those who have claimed the stories of our faith tradition? Bree Newsom in 2015, following the killings at Emmanuel AME, was moved to do something. She named in the interviews that before she climbed a flagpole to remove a Confederate flag, that she read the story of David and Goliath. And she heard within those pages the stories of a strength that would allow her to do what beyond her knowing. As we think of our faith stories today, who are the folks who are hungering and thirsting for righteousness? Who are the folks who come with their energy, conviction, and zeal that won't let a moment pass away? Who are the dreamers and the immigrant rights advocates? Who are the Parkland students and the Black Lives Matter? Think of all those who feel the injustice keenly, who don't know that the world is supposed to change and are willing to step into that moment. And what would it mean for us to cast our lots with those who are young and scrappy and hungry and say, these belong to us too, that our liberation is tied in the same? There's this moment I love in the Bible story when Saul tries to fit David into his armor and it just doesn't work. As we have a tendency to try to take those who are on fire and fit them into the boxes that we have known that are more reasonable and small, to slow down and equip with qualifiers and skills. When in fact, in some ways, we need to learn the opposite. To learn to take our armor off one piece at a time. To recognize when we are wearing our privilege and dismantle it. To look at the way we hold the arms of power and take them off. To see the freedom, the danger, and the faithfulness of those who walk into the world not weighed down by the things we thought would keep us safe, but to find in that potent moment that they are not left to their own. In the Bible story, there are these crowds in the field, and then David up front as their champion. The crowd places their lives in the hands of a boy so small he couldn't fit in the king's armor. When the stakes of the battle was high, whoever won would take the other people into captivity. So the crowd of the Israelites are watching this poor boy with 5 stones and saying, our fate rests with him. We need him to be victorious for us to be free. We are following the lead of a poor boy without a sword and praying for him like our lives depend on it. For this is a hard thing to do. To learn to follow those who hunger and thirst for a new moment, a new world, until we can feel that ache in our own bones. As we look at the story of Alexander Hamilton, we feel within it that energy, that potential to say, this is who we are and this is who we could be. This is the story of our people and our nation, and this is the story of who we could yet be as a people, as a nation. And so, as the church, who are we called to follow? but those who speak with boldness. Because our God is a God who equipped the uneducated church with words of fire and sent them into the world ablaze. Who are we called to follow but those who are hungry for righteousness? Because our God is a God who promised that they would be filled with justice and truth and mercy. Who are we called to follow but the unexpected leaders that God has anointed? Because our God is a God of the poor and the outcast, the least and the lost. Who are we called to follow but the ragtag crew of idealists who can't be idle, of fools who break down fences, of romantics who make things real, a bunch of revolutionary manumission abolitionists? Because our God is a God who sets people free. Let us yearn to follow the hungry, because God has promised that they will be filled.